The street was quiet most mornings, except for the sound of children rushing to school and shopkeepers opening their small stores. In the middle of that ordinary street stood a house that was anything but ordinary. It was tall, painted in shades of gray, and surrounded by high iron gates that seemed to warn people not to come closer. Behind those gates lived Mr. Ryan. To most people, he was a mystery. Some called him the grumpy man next door, others called him the millionaire who never smiled. He was the CEO of a big company in the city, a man who wore fine suits and drove expensive cars. But no matter how much he owned, there was always a coldness about him, as if happiness had forgotten where he lived. Every morning, the neighbors saw his black car roll out of the gate. He never waved, never stopped for small talk, and never seemed to notice anyone around him. People whispered that he liked to live alone, that he had no family, and that he had no time for anyone else's problems. Children avoided his side of the street, mothers warned their little ones not to bother him, and fathers shook their heads, saying, "That man has money, but no warmth." Just across the hedge from his grand house stood a much smaller home. It was old but tidy, with flower pots on the windows and curtains that swayed in the morning air. That house belonged to Aisha, a young mother, and her little daughter, Noor. Life had not been easy for them. After Noor's father passed away, Aisha worked long hours at a tailor's shop to provide for their needs. She left early in the morning and came back late, tired but determined. Noor was only 7, but she had already learned to do many things alone. She woke up by herself, tied her shoelaces, packed her bag, and walked to the nearby school every day. She was brave, but sometimes bravery could not hide the loneliness inside her small heart. She often looked at other children who held their parents' hands on the way to school, and she wished for the same. One cold morning, Noor stood at the end of the street, hugging her bag. She watched as the big black car rolled out of Mr. Ryan's house. The tinted windows made it impossible to see him, but she knew he was inside. She wondered what it must feel like to ride in a car like that, to sit beside someone who looked so strong and important. Something in her heart told her that maybe the man everyone feared was not as unreachable as he seemed. The next morning, she gathered her courage. As she saw him step out of his house, adjusting his watch and fixing his tie, she ran across the hedge. Her little shoes tapped against the ground as she tugged gently at the sleeve of his coat. Ryan looked down sharply. His eyes, used to boardrooms and business deals, narrowed at the sight of the small girl. "Good morning," Noor said brightly, her voice soft but full of hope. For a moment, he did not reply. He was not used to anyone greeting him outside his business world. Finally, in a voice that sounded unsure, he muttered, "Morning." Noor's face lit up at his reply. Then she took a small breath and asked the question that would change both of their lives. "Will you walk me to school?" she asked, clutching the strap of her bag tightly. Ryan blinked. Of all the requests he expected, this was not one of them. "Why would I do that?" he asked flatly, his tone carrying the same distance he showed to everyone. "Because," Noor's eyes dropped to the ground for a moment before lifting again, "I don't want to walk alone today." Her voice trembled slightly, but there was still a spark of hope in it. Something stirred in Ryan's chest, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He wanted to say no. He wanted to turn away and continue with his day as usual. But for some reason, his legs refused to move, and his heart would not let him ignore the child. He sighed, adjusting his tie again as if trying to remind himself who he was. But the little girl stood there, waiting, believing he might say yes. And so, without another word, he began to walk. Noor quickly matched her tiny steps to his long strides, her face glowing with joy. She hummed a little tune as they walked past the houses, pointing out small things like a cat on a wall or flowers in a garden. Ryan said nothing, but for the first time in years, he felt the silence around him begin to soften. When they reached the small school building, Noor turned to him with a wide smile. Thank you, she said simply before running off to join her classmates. Ryan stood there for a moment, watching her go. His chest felt strange, as if a door he had locked long ago had been opened just a little. He told himself it was nothing. Just one walk. Just one morning. But deep inside, something told him life had other plans. The morning after their first walk, Mr. Ryan convinced himself it had been a mistake. He was not someone who did small favors. He was not a man who had time to walk children to school. He told himself it was only because she had caught him off guard. But fate seemed to have other ideas. The next morning, when he stepped out of his house with his briefcase in hand, there she was again, little Noor, waiting with her schoolbag and her bright smile. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. Ryan froze. He looked at her, then at the street, half expecting her mother to appear. But Aisha had already left for work, rushing to the tailor's shop before sunrise. Noor stood alone, her small hands gripping her bag straps, her eyes filled with hope. He could have walked past her. He could have ignored her completely. But something in those innocent eyes made it hard to turn away. With a sigh, he said, "Come on then." Noor grinned, skipping a little to keep up with his long steps. This time, she did not stay silent. She began to talk, her words flowing like a small river. She pointed at the bakery they passed, telling him how the owner sometimes gave her a sweet bun. She showed him a tree where sparrows made their nests. She even told him about her teacher, who wore glasses that always slid down her nose. Ryan listened, though he did not reply much. He wasn't used to this kind of chatter. In his world, conversations were about profits, deadlines, and business deals. Yet here he was, listening to a little girl speak about birds and buns. To his surprise, he didn't find it annoying. Instead, it felt different. A kind of warmth he had long forgotten. When they reached the school, Noor stopped at the gate and turned to him with her usual smile. "Thank you again," she said softly before running off. Ryan stood there, watching her disappear into the crowd of children. Something in him wanted to stay longer, but he forced himself to turn back. He had a company to run, meetings to attend, and a reputation to maintain. Still, the image of her small hand waving stayed with him all day. That evening, when he returned home, Ryan noticed something unusual. From his study window, he saw Noor sitting on the porch of her house, coloring in a notebook. The street lights glowed softly, and she seemed lost in her little world. He had never noticed her before, even though she had been living right next door. He wondered how many things he had ignored in life, too focused on his own world to see the smaller ones around him. The next morning, Noor was waiting again. This time, she greeted him with a new question. "Do you have children?" she asked, tilting her head as they walked. Ryan nearly stumbled. "No," he said quickly, his voice firmer than he meant. "Why not?" she asked innocently, as children often do. He cleared his throat. "Because, it just didn't happen." Noor thought about his answer for a while. Then she said softly, "That's okay. You can still be like an uncle to someone." Ryan said nothing. But her words echoed in his mind long after they parted at the school gate. Days turned into a week. Their morning walks became routine. At first, Ryan told himself he was only doing it because the girl had no one else. But slowly, he realized it was more than that. He began to look forward to the walks. Noor's chatter filled the silence he had carried for years. She told him about her favorite storybook, about the songs she learned in class, and even about her dreams, one of which was to become a teacher one day. Ryan found himself listening more carefully each day, answering her questions with short but genuine replies. One morning, Noor shared something that struck him deeply. "My father used to walk me sometimes," she said softly. "He would hold my hand and tell me stories on the way. I miss him a lot." Ryan looked down at her, seeing the small sadness behind her smile. For a moment, his usually guarded heart ached. He wanted to say something comforting, but words failed him. Instead, he simply walked a little slower, letting her match her steps with his. That night, for the first time in years, Ryan found himself unable to sleep. He kept thinking of Noor's words, of the way her small voice carried both strength and longing. He thought about how he had built walls around himself, shutting out the world. And yet, this little girl had managed to walk straight into his life, as if she belonged there. By the end of the week, the neighbors began to notice. Whispers spread quickly. Have you seen? The grumpy CEO is walking the little girl to school every day. Some found it strange, others smiled at the sight. But Ryan didn't care what they thought. For reasons he could not yet explain, he felt lighter each morning he walked beside Noor. And though he still told himself it was temporary, deep down, he knew it was the beginning of something he had never expected. The morning sun painted the street in gold as Mr. Ryan stepped out of his house. He no longer felt surprised to see Noor waiting for him. She stood there in her neat uniform, her school bag on her back, her hair tied into two small braids. Her eyes sparkled as if walking with him was the most exciting part of her day. "Good morning," she greeted him with her usual cheer. "Morning," he replied, his voice softer than before. As they began walking, Noor started talking about her homework. She described how her teacher had praised her handwriting, and how she had solved a difficult math problem all on her own. Ryan nodded as she spoke, listening more carefully than he ever had to anyone outside of business. Halfway to school, Noor suddenly stopped and looked up at him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You already are," Ryan replied, raising a brow. She giggled softly but then grew serious. "Why are you always alone?" The question caught him off guard. He tightened his grip on his briefcase and looked straight ahead. "I like it that way," he said simply. "But don't you get lonely?" she asked, tilting her head. Ryan hesitated. Loneliness was something he never admitted to anyone, not even himself. His house was large, his office full of people, yet he knew the emptiness that followed him everywhere. But he wasn't about to share that with a child. "No," he said firmly, though the word felt heavier than he intended. Noor studied him for a moment, her innocent eyes searching his face. Then she smiled. "I think everyone needs someone. Even you." Her words echoed in his chest, stirring something he tried to push aside. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he was fine the way he was. But deep inside, he knew she was right. The following day, their walk was quieter. Noor seemed to sense his mood, and instead of asking questions, she hummed softly as they walked. Her little tune reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, something from long ago. At the school gate, Noor looked up at him again. "Will you come tomorrow too?" Ryan sighed. He wanted to say no, but the words never came. Instead, he found himself nodding. That evening, Ryan returned home later than usual. His mind was crowded with numbers, meetings, and decisions, but Noor's voice still lingered somewhere behind it all. After dinner, he sat in his study, staring at the empty shelves where personal photos should have been. His house was perfectly decorated, yet lifeless. It looked more like a hotel than a home. For the first time in years, he realized how quiet it truly was. From his window, he saw the small house next door. The lights were on, and through the thin curtains, he could see Noor sitting at the table with her books. Her mother sat beside her, helping with the homework. They looked tired, but there was warmth in that room, a warmth his house had never known. Ryan leaned back in his chair, a question slipping into his mind before he could stop it. Had he spent so many years building wealth only to end up with nothing that truly mattered? The next morning, Noor had a new story. She told him about a drawing competition at school and how she wanted to win. What will you draw? Ryan asked without thinking. Her eyes lit up. I want to draw my family. Ryan almost smiled but then noticed her expression shift. But it's only Mama and me now, she said softly. Sometimes, I draw Papa too, so it feels like he's still here. Ryan's heart tightened. He slowed his steps, looking at her small face that carried so much quiet strength. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't even sad in that moment. She was simply sharing a truth. Without realizing it, Ryan said, maybe you can draw more than that. You can add whoever makes you feel safe. Like you. Noor asked, her voice brightening. He almost stumbled again. He wanted to protest, to say he was not part of her family, that he was only her neighbor. But when he saw the hope in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to say no. Maybe, he replied softly. The days passed, and their walks became a habit neither of them wanted to break. Ryan's staff at the office noticed a change too. He smiled more often, even if only faintly. His temper was calmer, his tone gentler. No one knew why, but the reason was simple: it was the little girl who asked him questions no one else dared to ask. Yet, deep down, Ryan knew he was walking on unfamiliar ground. He had spent years avoiding connections, avoiding people who could matter. But now, Noor's presence was pulling him into a world he had long closed his heart to. And though he didn't say it out loud, he was beginning to realize something that scared him more than failure ever could: he didn't want the walks to end. The mornings had changed for Mr. Ryan. What once was a rushed routine of locking the door, adjusting his tie, and stepping into his car had now become something else. He still adjusted his tie, but instead of sliding into his expensive car, he looked for the little figure waiting with a schoolbag and a smile. Noor was always there, standing patiently near the gate. Sometimes she waved excitedly as soon as she saw him. Sometimes she simply smiled as if she already knew he would come. Every morning felt lighter, warmer, even if he never admitted it to himself. That morning, as they walked together, Noor skipped a little ahead, humming the song she had learned in school. Then she suddenly stopped, waiting for him to catch up. "Why don't you smile much?" she asked curiously. Ryan looked at her. "I don't need to," he replied in his usual serious tone. "But smiling makes people happy," Noor said matter-of-factly. "When Mama smiles, I feel better even if I'm sad. Maybe if you smiled more, your heart would feel lighter too." Her words made him pause. No one had spoken to him like that in years, simply, honestly, without fear. He didn't answer right away, but that morning, as he left her at the school gate, he felt his lips curve just slightly. Noor noticed and clapped her hands. "You smiled," she said happily. "It was nothing," he muttered, embarrassed. "It was something," she insisted before running inside. At work, Ryan found himself distracted. During meetings, he caught himself remembering Noor's words, her laughter, and the way she looked up at him as if he was more than just a grumpy man in a suit. His staff noticed the difference in him too. His voice was calmer, his instructions gentler. Some wondered if he had finally found peace. That evening, when he came home, he again saw Noor on her porch, drawing in her notebook. She noticed him and waved. "Look," she called. Curious, he walked closer. Noor held up a page with a colorful picture. It showed a small house, a woman with long hair, a little girl with braids, and beside them, a tall man in a suit. "That's you," she explained proudly, pointing at the tall figure. Ryan froze. "Me?" "Yes. You walk me to school now, so you're part of my drawing." For a moment, he didn't know what to say. His chest tightened, not with discomfort but with something new, something he hadn't felt in years. "It's good," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. Noor grinned, pleased with his approval. As days passed, the bond between them grew. Noor had questions every day, small ones, big ones, even silly ones. What's your favorite color? Do you like ice cream? Why is your house so quiet? At first, Ryan gave short answers. But slowly, he began sharing more. He told her he liked blue because it reminded him of the sea. He admitted he had not eaten ice cream in years. And when she asked about his house, he hesitated before replying, because I live alone. Noor thought for a moment before saying softly, then maybe it needs laughter. That night, Ryan sat alone in his large dining room, staring at the untouched meal. Her words echoed in his ears. He realized how empty the house felt, not because of its size, but because there was no one to share it with. One Saturday morning, Noor knocked on his gate. It was the first time she had ever come to him instead of waiting. When Ryan opened the door, she held up a small plate covered with a cloth. "Mama made extra parathats. She said you should have some." Ryan blinked, surprised. He could not remember the last time someone had cooked for him outside of his hired chef. He took the plate carefully. "Tell your mother, thank you." Noor grinned. "Come eat with us next time. Mama said neighbors should share meals." He almost refused out of habit. But then he saw the hope in her eyes. Something inside him whispered that maybe, just this once, he should say yes. That evening, for the first time since he moved into the grand house, Ryan crossed the hedge into the smaller, humbler home next door. The living room smelled of fresh food, and though the furniture was old, the warmth was undeniable. Aisha welcomed him politely, offering tea, while Noor chattered happily, as if he had always belonged there. As he sat at their modest table, listening to Noor talk about school, watching Aisha smile tiredly yet kindly, Ryan felt something stir in his heart. He didn't recognize it at first, but then he realized it was comfort. For years, he had been surrounded by wealth but starved of this simple feeling. And now, sitting with a little girl and her mother, he understood what his house had been missing. When he returned home that night, his mansion felt even colder than before. But instead of feeling trapped by the silence, he felt determined. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why, but he knew this: the little girl next door had already begun to change his life. The days of silence in Mr. Ryan's life had long faded. Each morning, Noor was there, waiting for him with her smile and endless stories. Each evening, he often found himself glancing at the little house next door, sometimes even stopping by to share a meal with Noor and her mother. It was strange, even to him. For years, he had locked himself away in his grand mansion, avoiding people and burying himself in work. Now, a little girl had opened a door in his heart that he thought would never open again. But the change brought confusion too. One evening, Ryan sat alone in his study after returning from a long day at work. The silence of his house pressed heavily on him. He thought about Noor's laughter, about her small hand waving goodbye each morning, about the way she had drawn him in her picture as if he already belonged in her family. He rubbed his forehead, whispering to himself, "What am I doing?" He was a CEO, a man respected and feared in business. People obeyed him, admired him, envied him. Yet here he was, losing sleep over the words of a 7-year-old. He wondered if he was being foolish, if he was letting emotions cloud the life he had built so carefully. But then another thought came: was it really foolish to feel human again? The next morning, Noor greeted him with her usual excitement. But she noticed something different in his face. "You look tired," she said, tilting her head. "I didn't sleep much," Ryan admitted. "You should drink warm milk," Noor suggested seriously. "Mama says it helps." For the first time in years, he laughed a small, real laugh. "I'll keep that in mind." Noor smiled, satisfied that she had helped. As they walked, she began telling him about a school play. "I want to join," she said, "but I'm scared to stand on stage." Ryan looked at her. Why scared? Because everyone will look at me, she said softly. What if I forget my lines? He slowed his steps. Do you know what I do every day? You sit in a big office, Noor guessed. Yes, but before that, I stand in front of people. I speak to hundreds of them sometimes. And I used to be afraid too. Her eyes widened. Really? Really, he nodded. But I learned something. People don't remember small mistakes. They remember if you speak with courage. So even if you forget a line, say it again with a smile. That's what they'll remember. Noor listened carefully, her little face full of thought. Then she nodded. Okay. I'll be brave. And for a moment, Ryan felt proud in a way he hadn't felt in years. Later that week, Ryan was invited to Noor's school play. He almost refused. He had never been to such events before, and his schedule was always full. But Noor looked up at him with pleading eyes. Please come. Just this once. He sighed. I'll try. On the evening of the play, Ryan found himself sitting in a small school hall surrounded by excited parents and children. It was strange for him, a man used to grand events and luxurious gatherings, to sit on a wooden bench with ordinary people. Yet he felt oddly comfortable. When Noor came on stage, dressed in a simple costume, his heart tightened. She looked nervous at first, but then she spotted him in the crowd. Her face lit up, and she stood taller. She spoke her lines clearly, her voice steady. And when the play ended, she bowed with a proud smile. Ryan clapped harder than anyone else. After the play, Noor ran up to him. Did you see? I was brave. He smiled, placing a gentle hand on her head. Yes, you were. Very brave. That night, as he returned to his empty house, he realized something important. He wasn't just helping Noor. She was helping him too. She was teaching him to smile again, to laugh again, to feel again. But along with that realization came a storm of emotions. He feared what it meant. He feared how attached he was becoming. He feared that one day, this bond might break and he wasn't sure if his heart could survive that. Sitting alone in his large, silent study, he whispered to himself, why does she matter so much to me? There was no answer. Only the memory of a little girl's voice echoing in his mind, everyone needs someone. Even you. And for the first time, he admitted silently, she was right. The mornings had become brighter for Mr. Ryan. Each day began the same way. He adjusted his tie, stepped out of his gate, and found Noor waiting for him. Her cheerful good morning had become the one thing he looked forward to. It was strange, but he no longer felt like the man who lived behind iron walls. He felt seen. But one morning, when he stepped outside, the street was quiet. The little figure he expected to see was missing. Ryan frowned, checking his watch. Perhaps he was early? He waited for a few minutes, but Noor didn't appear. The silence of the street pressed against him, heavier than usual. Finally, he walked over to the small house next door and knocked gently. Aisha opened the door, her face tired but kind. She looked surprised to see him. Is everything all right? He asked quickly. Aisha sighed. Noor isn't well. She has a fever, so she can't go to school today. For a moment, Ryan felt a sharp ache in his chest. He didn't know why it worried him so much, but it did. Is it serious? No, just a fever. She'll be fine with rest, Aisha reassured. From inside, a weak voice called out, is that him, Mama? Ryan stepped inside almost without thinking. Noor was lying on a small bed in the living room, her cheeks flushed. When she saw him, her eyes brightened a little. You came, she whispered, smiling faintly. He pulled a chair closer and sat beside her. Of course. You weren't there this morning. I didn't want to miss walking with you, she said softly. But Mama said I should rest. Ryan didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to such honesty, such warmth. All he could manage was, "You'll get better soon." That day at work, his mind was elsewhere. Numbers, reports, and meetings all blurred together. He kept remembering Noor's small voice, her pale face, the way she still smiled through her fever. His employees noticed his distraction, but no one dared to ask questions. When evening came, instead of going straight home, Ryan stopped at a shop. He bought a box of crayons and a storybook. He had never shopped for a child before, and the feeling was oddly new. At Noor's house, Aisha welcomed him with a surprised look. "You didn't need to," she began. But Ryan shook his head. "It's nothing." He walked over to Noor, who sat up weakly on her bed. Her eyes widened at the sight of the gifts. "For me?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "So you don't get bored while you rest." Her smile lit up the whole room. "Thank you. You're the best neighbor ever." Something in his chest softened again, almost painfully. Over the next 2 days, Ryan visited often. Sometimes he brought soup, sometimes fruit, sometimes just himself. He sat with Noor while she colored, listening to her chatter even in her weak voice. He spoke more with Aisha too, noticing the quiet strength she carried as a single mother. One evening, as he was leaving, Aisha stopped him. "You don't have to do all this. We'll be fine." Ryan looked at her seriously. "I know. But I want to." She studied him for a moment, then smiled gently. "In that case, thank you." Her words warmed him more than he expected. When Noor finally recovered, she was more excited than ever to walk with him again. On their first morning back, she practically skipped down the street. "Did you miss me?" she asked playfully. Ryan gave a small smile. "Yes. The mornings were too quiet." Noor laughed. "See? I told you everyone needs someone." He shook his head, but he couldn't deny the truth anymore. She was right. He did need someone. And somehow, that someone was a little girl who had walked into his life with nothing but kindness. But with this realization came a new fear. That night, as he sat alone in his grand house, he asked himself a question he could not answer: what if this doesn't last? He had built his life on control, on certainty. But with Noor, nothing was certain. She could grow up and forget him. Circumstances could change. Life could take them in different directions. And yet, he couldn't imagine going back to the way things were. For the first time in years, Mr. Ryan was not afraid of failure in business. He was afraid of losing something far more fragile: the bond that had quietly become the most important part of his life. The bond between Mr. Ryan and Noor had grown stronger with each passing day. What began as a single walk to school had turned into something no one in the neighborhood could ignore. The once grumpy millionaire was now seen almost every morning beside a little girl in braids, listening to her chatter, sometimes even smiling. The neighbors whispered about it, but their whispers had softened. Instead of calling him cold and distant, they now said, "Maybe he isn't as hard as we thought." Children who once feared his serious face now greeted him shyly. Some even waved. For Ryan, none of that mattered. What mattered was the way Noor's eyes lit up when she saw him, the way she trusted him, and the way her small hand reached for his without hesitation. One evening, Noor knocked on his gate again. When he opened it, she stood there holding a folded paper. "What's this?" he asked. "It's a letter," she said proudly. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a drawing of 3 figures holding hands: a woman, a little girl, and a tall man in a suit. Underneath, in her shaky handwriting, Noor had written, "My family." Ryan froze. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he could not speak. No one had ever called him part of a family for years. He had been alone for so long that he almost forgot what it felt like to belong. "Do you like it?" Noor asked nervously. He cleared his throat. "Yes," he said softly. "I like it very much." She beamed. "Good. Because I mean it." That night, Ryan placed the drawing on his study desk, right where he could see it. For the first time, his house did not feel so empty. Days passed, and Ryan became more involved in Noor's life. He attended her school events, helped her with small homework questions, and even shared quiet dinners with her and Aisha. The little house next door had become a place of comfort for him. But deep down, he still carried fear. He feared what would happen if one day Noor didn't need him anymore. He feared that this happiness was too fragile to last. One morning, as they walked, Noor looked up at him with her usual curiosity. "Will you always walk me to school?" she asked suddenly. The question struck his heart. He looked down at her, her small face filled with innocence and trust. He could have given a careful answer. He could have said, "We'll see," or "for now." But something inside him refused to hide anymore. "Yes," he said firmly. "As long as you want me to." Noor smiled, satisfied. "Then I'll never walk alone again." Later that week, Ryan was invited by Aisha to share a simple dinner once more. This time, something felt different. The house was filled with laughter, Noor's bright giggles, Aisha's soft chuckles, even Ryan's quiet amusement at their stories. At one point, Noor rested her head on his arm and said sleepily, "You're not grumpy anymore." Ryan smiled faintly. "Maybe not. Because you have us," she murmured before drifting off. Aisha looked at Ryan, her eyes reflecting gratitude. "She thinks of you like family now," she said softly. Ryan glanced at the sleeping child, then at the woman across the table. For years, he had lived in loneliness, surrounding himself with wealth but starving his heart. And now, without planning it, without expecting it, he had found something far more valuable: belonging. That night, as he walked back to his grand house, the silence no longer frightened him. He knew he was no longer alone. In his study, he looked again at Noor's drawing. The three figures holding hands seemed to smile back at him. For the first time, he allowed himself to whisper words he had long buried: "This is what I was missing." The next morning, when he stepped out of his gate, Noor was already waiting, her braids swaying as she waved. "Ready?" she asked. "Always," he replied. And so, the grumpy CEO who once walked alone now walked with a little girl by his side, carrying a promise in his heart that he would never let her walk alone again.